It's a true crime podcast that focuses solely on the unidentified victims of sexual assault and violence. And She Goes by Jane, Aimee Baker, and Vanessa Ciccarelli tell the stories of thousands of Jane Does, taking the focus off of the perpetrator and onto the victim. I'm Julie Holliday. Welcome to this episode of Evergreen Spotlight. Aimee, hi. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, thank you for inviting me.
Yay. Okay, first things first, how did you and Vanessa meet? And also, more importantly, how did you act on the question, do you want to make a podcast?
So Vanessa and we live in the same town, and we've kind of, circled around each other for years, being like, she seems cool, but like maybe too cool for me. And Vanessa saw me give a reading of my poetry and give like a mini lecture. And she turned to her husband, Jason, and was like, this is our film project. So we first worked together on a film project together. And then, over the course of the time we were working on it, I kept on being like, this would be a great podcast. And Vanessa was like, why don't you do it? And I was like, I am a ruminator. Give me 7 to 10 years to think on it.
Right.
Yeah. And she was like, let's do it. And I was like, well, I guess we're doing it. So that's with her encouragement, we started the podcast together.
And let's talk a little bit more about this documentary. So you're giving some credit to Vanessa for really being the one to kind of wrangle, because I can relate to ideas building and then falling and like never really coming to fruition. How was creating a documentary? Like, I know you starred in it, but how was that experience? We would love to know like the difference really too between podcasting and documentary making for you.
Right. So the documentary, it originally started out, this was pre-pandemic. It was like the year it started. So we sat down, and it was going to be like a short artist, documentary, kind of going over my process as a writer. And then everything shut down. And Vanessa works as a commercial and personal private photographer. And so her industry just really dried up at that point. Yeah. And so we took it to the next level. So, her husband, Jason, who is a director on the film, started talking to some people, and they're like, why don't you make it more expansive? And so Jason would just like call me up. Like, I'm like sitting in my house, like I haven't left my house in months. And he'd call up and be like, we talked to so-and-so, this celebrity person, about being part of the documentary, right? And I was like, oh, we're talking to celebrities now? Like, that's where we are. Like, what happened to the small mini documentary? So it really grew out of this like sort of isolation that we were all feeling as artists, really.
And it's really based around your poetry that you write based off of these true crime stories. Is that correct?
It is, yes.
I just think the way that you also include your poetry in the podcast episodes itself is so unique. Can you maybe give us some insight into that decision? Like, you've used people like Dee Wallace and Kathy Najimy to record these poems that you've written. Like, where does the poems originate? And really, we would love to know how you're getting these these very high profile celebrities to then record as well.
Right. So I am a writer by training. And this whole project, the very origins of it was me sitting in my apartment in Tempe, Arizona, and seeing and hearing a story of a young missing woman who was known as Maricopa Jane Doe at the time. She was unidentified. And I wanted to approach that somehow creatively and express kind of the feelings that I was having about what had happened to her. And then that sort of culminated. I wrote one poem, and there was another and another and another. And there was all these cases and stories that I hadn't heard before that weren't getting media attention. And to me, poetry is a way to sort of stop and rest in the moment and think about something. It's not a quick experience, right? Often there's like that moment you have to kind of pull apart what's going on in the poem. And that makes you sit with that story a little bit longer. And to me, that was an artistic expression of wanting to honor these women and their stories and get their names heard in a different kind of format. And that became my book, Doe. And then that transformed into She, and now it's the She Goes by Jane podcast. And we had this moment where we could have had me read the poems. I read my poems publicly all the time. I lecture at universities. I do public performances. But we wanted to give other women and non-binary artists the chance to participate in this as well. So, yeah, I too would like to know how we managed to get so many celebrities to sign on. But I think it's just that so many other people understand what we're doing and want to participate and also want to call attention to missing and unidentified women.
Exactly. And I just think it's such an inspirational nugget for, podcasters all over to do something so unique like that and to kind of adapt it for what it would, like how it would make sense for them. But I just think it's a great idea.
Mm-hmm.
In She Goes by Jane, you hardly speak of the actual perpetrator's name, and you focus solely on the victim. And what has been your motivation behind that?
Part of it was this realization that, particularly with cases where there's perpetrators, so not all of them involve perpetrators, but when there are, how much media attention, how much recognition goes into remembering their names, right? And I just remember giving a public performance. There's going to be a series of episodes that we're going to be doing in the future based on one of my long poems. It's a 12-page long poem. And I just remember giving this reading and then someone just rushing up to me at the end, wanting to talk about the perpetrator in that. And I had said his name during the performance just to give some context. And they were just, they had this encyclopedic, knowledge of him. And I was like, even after all of that we just went through after reading that poem, hearing those women's names, we're still resting in repeating his name. And that really transformed how I wanted to approach our podcast and even the film. I wanted us to move away from that so that the name we remember at the end, the name that we keep on saying over and over and over, is the woman's name.
What is one of your favorite episodes, or an episode that you really point listeners to often?
Oh, it's so hard because they're all they feel like my baby. I've been carrying these women's names for so long, right. But I think one of the ones that I'm particularly point people to is the story of Nahida Khatib, which she was a woman who not much was out there on the internet about her, or even in media reports. You can search newspapers for her name. There's not a lot of coverage of her. And we were able to get a obviously heavily redacted police file for her, which really informed and gave us a lot of information about her experience. Her experience as a domestic violence survivor at the time, dealing with her partner and all that. And so I point to that one just because I think that does good work in highlighting a story that typically wouldn't be covered in a podcast. And thankfully, that's also the podcast episode that Kathy Najimy joined us on. And having her voice participate in that with us was a really moving experience for me.
I had the pleasure of listening to her recite that poem, and it was very moving. It was really cool to have her a part of that show. I can hardly watch scary movies. They haunt me. And so I'm wondering if these stories stick with you, or if it makes you more scared in your private life.
Oh, yeah. So for me, no. I am a violence survivor in several different categories. For Vanessa, though, it's a completely different experience because she doesn't watch scary movies either. None of the true crime things that I mentioned to her ever ring a bell to her. And so for her, yes, she tells me frequently that she's had nightmares, and it just gets a little bit more anxious, particularly worried about her children. And for me, I'm like, I've already been existing in the world kind of with an awareness of the violence that can happen. So we have very different, I sleep fine at night. Vanessa does not. Yeah.
Sorry, Vanessa.
Sorry, Vanessa. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that about your past as well. Can you maybe take us through your process of like fact checking and or yours and Vanessa's process of how you research for the stories?
Right. One of the things that we do is we try to research as much as possible. Sometimes that is getting police files. Sometimes they're not so willing to give those up. Like we have one that is so redacted that it just said, a person went missing from this address. It didn't even say her name or the full address. And that's it for the file. And so, in most cases, there's moments where you have to decide, like, should I like not tell that story? Should we not create a podcast episode about that? But I think that there are so many stories that get passed over because of that lack of information. And we don't pretend to be an investigative podcast at all. So we just present the information that we know. Our sources are sometimes pages long of just the list of sources that we have just to back up everything that we've put in an episode. So we want to do our due diligence in that regard to make sure that we're not doing harm in presenting something, that hasn't been backed up. And also we're not involved in speculation either. So, often I'll say, like, we'll see how that comes out.
Why is it that you think so many women are unidentified?
Yeah, so I think that for so long there were such limited resources and communication between like policing agencies that the cases just, they build up over time. And as time passes, there's like little interest to spend the finances to resurrect those cases. And so often you'll see something like, it's been, 40 years. This might not be, top priority, right? But I think with like the changes in investigative genetic genealogy and new investigative processes, like that opens the door to more of those happening. So hopefully talking about it as much as we do inspires other people to resurrect some cases that might have been sitting on the shelf for so long.
Definitely. And that brings me to the next question I have, which is the overall message for you and Vanessa, for your listeners. Like maybe you could give us like some insight about what you hope listeners take away. And also we're curious of any advice or tips you would have for females in general to help prevent these attacks.
Yeah. So I think the main takeaway for our podcast is twofold, right? There's so many instances in which we memorialize people just by naming them. So if you think about something like the 9/11 memorials or Vietnam memorials, they'll have public readings where like their names are said, the people who have passed have been said. And I think that on one level, this is like also symbolic that we're saying those names and memorializing and remembering them in some way.
Yes.
On the other hand, one of the things I think is important is to share stories and to continue to share stories. And you never know where a story might end up, like if it gets in front of the right person at the right time. So I think that's also part of our process. As for, the takeaway of like, what women can do, one of the things that I think about is women, our whole lives have been shaped by messaging about ways in which we're unsafe. Like the stories that we tell in our podcast, sometimes I have to remind myself and I have to remind other people that based on those stories, those are the stories that we heard that changed our behaviors in the first place, right? So, riding a bike alone along like a stretch of desert, that's a story that we hear that we're like, ooh, should I go out alone and do that? Hitchhiking, right? Like that used to be really prevalent for both, men and women. stories of harm that have happened there really changed our behavior. So I think that in a lot of ways, we as women particularly have consumed this, not even just through the true crime genre, but it's just all around us about how to live our lives to be more safe. And part of that is incredibly sad to me because there's so much that is blocked from us from enjoying on a regular basis. Like I was thinking, this morning I took my dog for a walk, and we usually walk at the same time in the same direction. And I was like, oh, should we be like, if someone knows that they can find me in a certain location alone at a certain time, So I think, we do kind of already exist in a world in which like we've absorbed this information and have put safeguards in place.
Is there anything else that you would like to add or to make sure that others take away from today and from your show?
I think one of the things that I'm working on outside of She Goes by Jane, because I cannot live with just apparently one project going, is I'm working with a woman. It's to tell her story of a wrongful conviction. And the only way in which that case moved forward was by like her sheer will and determination in keeping her mother who was murdered in light and centered, and pushing forward to find the real perpetrator of the crime. And I often think about this with our missing and unidentified women as well. Some of the cases that have been most successful in being resolved are because someone sat down and said, I am going to put my energy and effort here. Whether it's a family member or an outsider, they pushed those stories to the forefront and really were advocates in it.
Yes. I hope our listeners can just really take that and run with it, of just being an advocate for those who can't speak or those who were harmed.
Exactly.
Aimee, thank you so much. Where can our listeners get to know more about you?
So both Vanessa and I are active on primarily Instagram is where you can find us. So we, of course, have our She Goes by Jane page or account on Instagram. And then I'm there as Aimee.e.Baker, and Vanessa's there as Vanessa Ciccarelli with an _. So you can follow us there. She's doing some amazing stuff in film work and making music videos for artists. And I'm doing my writing and reading thing. So we post about those sorts of topics.
Wonderful. Well, we can't wait to hear more. Thank you so much for being a part of today.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Evergreen Spotlight with Aimee from She Goes by Jane. For more information about the podcast, check out evergreenpodcast.com, where you'll find the full list of thought-provoking, always relevant, and always growing shows. Until next time, thanks for watching.